Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a day that doesn't suck. Today we're hitting up some malicious compliance. Let's jump right in. This story comes to us from A Quiet Borderline, Brad, and the Table. This story was told to me by my friend Lucy. At the time, she lived in an army town and worked for many summers at a restaurant popular with the officers and their families. At this particular restaurant, which is on the higher end, there's a table reserved for high-ranking officers who visit the base. People who work there refer to it as the table. On busier nights, when there isn't a higher-ranking officer in town, it's utilized to seat more patrons, but for the most part, it's left alone. It's Friday, so it's busy. There is a general visiting the base, so the table isn't being used, just in case he decided to grace the establishment with his presence. Lucy is manning her section when the owner, named John for the purposes of this story, waves her down. She heads over and he tells her, "I need you and Annie, another server, to help me man the table." "The general is coming?" she asked. "Nope, Brad is." Lucy rolled her eyes. Brad was a local bigwig's high school age son, and he had it in his mind that he was a hotshot. He frequented the restaurant with his girl of the week and proceeded to make a nuisance of himself every time, but not enough to the point that he was asked to leave. Lucy asked John, "Are you sure? What if the general wants to eat dinner with us?" At this, John leaned in with a wide smile and said, "Apparently, the general called and told us to give Brad the table, and to give him and his guests anything he wanted." Lucy then smiled as she realized what was about to happen. Brad was about to get a serving of malicious compliance on the house. 20 minutes later, Brad, wearing a West Point blazer, arrives with several young people. John makes a big show of greeting them and escorting them to the table. The people look around impressed, and Brad proceeds to command Lucy, John, and Annie around like he owns the restaurant. The only good thing about this particular experience was that, due to him being underage, Brad and his buddies never tried to order any alcohol. Brad proceeded to be a nuisance, demanding more appetizers, sending food back because it wasn't cooked just right, ordering the most expensive entrees on the menu, yada yada yada. Lucy, Annie, and John continue with this, smiling as more and more food is added to the table. It's time for the check. Lucy told me that the entire group managed to rack up $843.29, not counting the mandatory gratuity because the party is above a certain size. Brad gets the bill, and he flips out. "What is this?" he barked, waving the check. "It's your check," John said. "The general said to let you order anything you wanted." Brad stands up to argue, and that's when the host rushes up, her face white. "John, the general is here," she whispered. Everyone turns to look, and there's the general with his entourage. John excuses himself before going over. He and the general start to talk for a few minutes, and Lucy notices Brad turning white and starting to get out of his seat. Annie looked at him and said, "You better not try a dine and dash." She said, "I really don't want to have to sick these nice officers on you." Brad sat down and fidgeted. John and the general come back to the table. Making eye contact with Brad, John said, "Brad, you said the good general here insisted you have the table and that you can order anything you want. Is this true?" He only nodded. "Well, the general here said that he never made such a phone call." "That's odd," Brad said, before looking at the general. "I'm pretty sure it was you I talked to, sir." "I have the phone number, let's call it," John said, pulling out his cell phone and dialing a number. That's when they hear Brad's brand new cell phone going off in his pocket. The general held his hand out, and Brad puts the phone in his hand. He checks the number and asks John, "Is your number 123-456-7890? "It is," John said. The general then proceeded to get a serious look on his face. "Brad, are you a cadet?" "I'm being considered for an appointment," Brad said. The general nodded. "I suggest you pay your bill, tip in full, and apologize to the staff for your behavior," he said to Brad. "I also suggest withdrawing your name as soon as possible to save yourself the embarrassment." Keeping his head down, Brad paid the bill, meekly apologized, and left with his sycophants. The general and his entourage patiently waited for the table to be cleared and set. They proceeded to have a nice meal, leaving a generous tip and apologizing for people like Brad. Lucy proceeded to have a wonderful Brad-free career. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Reddit Admins Are Morons. It says, "Well, that's a spectacular way to ruin your career before you even start one. Kind of like that idiot that flipped the bird to the guy he cut off to steal his parking space, only to have his job interview with him." Another commenter down below called SweetTaylor7596 said, "It's wonderful when officers and managers like that exist. Too often, they don't. I'm actually pretty shocked that Brad had the money to pay without having to ask his parents." Don't you love it when an extremely entitled person gets put right in their place? In this case, Brad might have just ruined his whole career path. On top of that, he looks like a pretty big douchebag in front of all the people he brought into that restaurant as well. So not only is his career going away, but it sounds like some of his friend group might be going as well. Hopefully Brad learns a lesson from this one, but I doubt it. These kinds of people just keep on doing the same old crap over and over again because they're just so into themselves that they don't care what anybody else thinks. This story comes to us from Stuck to PC, please help. Want us to strictly follow company policies? No problem. This malicious compliance comes from a few years ago when I was working as an external developer for a software house. The team was great and the lead developer, let's call him Mark, was simply the best to work with. He was a very skilled developer with also the ability to easily coordinate the team's tasks. We also had a manager, John, who was also very friendly and easy to talk to. Our job was going smoothly. The company tracked the progress of the various projects in a software where John divided them in various steps. John set up these steps very broadly: analysis, initial setup, development, release, maintenance, to avoid creating too many of them. We then needed to input the time we spent on each of these steps. If the project was missing some steps or hit the budget cap, we couldn't input our timesheets and, technically, weren't allowed to start working. Per company policy, our duty was to inform our direct supervisor about this issue. In this case, Mark. He then should have informed John, who finally would have to increase the cap. As the good manager that he was, John knew all these steps were a huge waste of Mark's and our time. So he allowed us to temporarily sign our timesheets locally and start or continue our work, gather himself all of our cap increase requests together, do all of them simultaneously, and then directly let us know we could input our timesheets in the software. Then, the company got acquired by a hedge fund. Suddenly, a lot of new middle managers appeared, and John was moved to a higher position in a different department. To replace him, they hired Phil. Phil tried to present himself as the open to everyone's requests manager, but it became obvious pretty quickly that he was more a "I'll stick to company policies as harder as I can" guy, probably to appeal to his ego or to some higher up. First thing he did was to completely change the project's organization to better check the project advancement. Now, in a project, every task, every little change had its own step and budget cap. Remember that if the step was not in the software, we weren't allowed to start working on it. He then enforced our daily timesheets input. It became mandatory to input them at maximum the next day, so we could be more responsible about marking the project progress. It could have been okay if it wasn't for the fact that projects' budgets were drastically reduced. Basically, after reaching the middle of our development, we already reached those caps and could not insert any more timesheets. When we started asking Phil about creating those steps or raising the budget caps like we did with John, he quickly redirected us to Mark, as That was the company policy and the proper chain of command. Mark's job quickly became hell, as he basically had to spend half the day asking Phil to create project steps or raise caps. We knew we were bothering Mark, and he knew we couldn't do anything else. He tried to talk to Phil about easing these policies, but without success. At the end of the month, everyone was behind with the timesheets input, and some tasks were not started at all. Phil gathered us and other teams and started his rant about how it was our fault since we required too much time to do our job, and it was not acceptable. As our team leader, Mark was particularly targeted and probably missed some bonuses that he had no problem getting when John was the manager. His fault? Not letting Phil know soon enough that steps weren't available or budget caps were reached. It was enough for him. It was time to maliciously comply to company policies. He asked Phil to let us stay some minutes after the meeting to explain us how to resolve these issues. He agreed, but wanted to stay in the meeting too. Mark calmly said to us, "It is imperative that you tell me, and only me, that steps are missing or caps have been reached as soon as you notice. You must send me an email with this precise subject. I'll then inform Phil. Only mail requests will be accepted." He remarked various times that the mail needed to have a specific subject format, like Project X, Step Y, Missing, or Project X, Step Y, Cap Reached. And every time he was looking at us with a look that was saying, "Just do like I say, trust me." We started doing exactly what he told us, and soon discovered why he was so confident. A few days passed, and an angry Phil stormed in our room, yelling at Mark that his behavior was unacceptable, and an urgent meeting with the higher-ups was scheduled in a few minutes. Mark went, and after about half an hour, returned with a satisfied smile on his face, and after him, a defeated Phil. He later told us that he basically set up a forwarding rule in his mailbox, which forwarded to Phil every single mail whose subjects matched the patterns above, with a predefined text like, "Dear Phil, I'd like to inform you that the team brought to my attention the fact that Project X ID missing Step Y or similar." In those few days, he submerged Phil's mailbox with our requests. Phil probably hoped that the outcome of the meeting would have went in his favor, but the higher-up stated that no company policy was violated. Mark wasn't spamming, as those were all legitimate work-related emails, and was Phil's duty to appropriately manage the situation. Also, Mark now had proof that he was immediately notifying Phil about the project issues, so nothing could be his or our fault anymore. I stopped working for the company shortly after, but after a few months, they told me that Phil was demoted and moved to another position with lesser responsibilities. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Gemini27. It says, "I wonder how many times in that last meeting, Mark said, as per Phil's new policy, demanding ABC, he was informed of X at this time and date, and here's the proof." Basically just ramming home the point that Phil's ideas were not signed off by anyone above Phil, and they were 100% Phil's personal decision that wasn't backed up by company policy or requirements. Another user down below called Chaotic Bear said, "Never ever get on the wrong side of someone who can automate sending emails." So I guess you could say at this company they all had their fill of Phil. I like how at the beginning of this story, OP painted a picture of a company that was just working really well. Then the hedge fund came in, a whole bunch of other managers showed up, and everything went to crap. But Mark was still there, and Mark was still the wonderful person that Mark was before. And then Mark asked them for a very specific task done a very specific way, and the people there had to know that Mark had something up his sleeve. This story comes to us from a random teacher, debit cards. I work at Woodforest National Bank. For those who don't know, it's a bank based out of Texas, located primarily on the East Coast inside of Walmart. This story happened about a month ago. One of our usual entitled Karen customers comes into the bank demanding we print her a new debit card because she lost her old one. We issued debit cards the same day so long as they pay a debit card fee, $10 for a reprint or $15 for a new card, waived for certain accounts. A reprint was a simple task, so I print her card and send her on her way. She then walks back into the bank because the last two numbers were slightly rubbed off. This is due to how the machine prints the cards and is pretty common. I want you to print this card again. Is it not working? Look at the last two numbers. Other banks don't give me cards with rubbed off numbers. I'm sorry, ma'am, but sometimes that happens with the machine. It rubs part of the numbers off when activating the chip. I don't care. It looks terrible. Do it again. Ma'am, I don't think this is a good idea. We really don't have control over how the machine, entitled Karen raised her voice. I don't care what you have to do. Just print my card again so it looks nice. She takes a pair of scissors and cuts up the card into tiny pieces in front of me. Print the effing card now, or do I have to close my account and contact Market Manager's name? The Market Manager isn't someone you would know unless you have had a conversation with him before. It's obvious she's trying to name drop him to get me to shut up and comply. Cue Malicious Compliance. I turn over to my manager and he gives me a nod. I then put on a devious smile and say, absolutely, ma'am, but to ensure this won't happen again, we will need to change the numbers. So I'm going to need you to sign some things. See, was that so hard? We then spend the next 10 minutes printing out new cards until we get one that doesn't have the numbers slightly rubbed off. Each time the card isn't to her liking, she cuts it up and says to do it again. I just smile and say, sorry about this, let's try again each time, until about 8 cards later, she finally gets a card number that isn't rubbed off. Finally, this card looks good, thanks. She just leaves with a smug grin, thinking she won, and leaving us with her massive pile of cut-up debit cards. What we forgot to remind her of is having a completely new card generated outside of fraud or expiration costs $15 to be deducted from your account. This is made clear at account opening, and since she signed off on having all these new cards printed, there was nothing she could say. Normally, I try and help people avoid bank fees, but in this case, F this entitled woman. A couple days later, she comes storming into the bank looking pissed. What the F did you do to my account? I'm sorry, ma'am, but what seems to be the problem? There's a bunch of debit card fees on my account. What the F did you do? Oh, every time you had me print a new debit card for you, the other day, a $15 fee was charged to your account. The first one, where you only had me reprint the card number, was only $10. You need to effing reverse these fees right now before I call Market Manager name and get you fired. At this point, my manager steps in. Hello, ma'am, what's the issue? Your dumb butt employee tricked me into paying over $100 worth of fees because he kept effing up my debit card. Ma'am, could you please not yell? Also, I was there. You demanded we print you a new debit card because you didn't like the numbers being rubbed off. We have your signature on these forms stating that you wanted these cards to be printed. I will not be reversing these fees for you. Then I want to close my account. Okay, but first, you need to pay off your negative account balance as well as your line of credit. Just give me Market Manager name, number, this instant. Sorry, ma'am, but we aren't at liberty to just give out his number like that. Here's the number to customer service if you would like. This is true, as he's instructed us to not give his number out to any customer who asks. The only people who need his number already have it. She takes the number and screams, I'll have your jobs for this, flips us off, kicks over a chair, and storms out. We get a call from customer care later about the incident, where we explain everything and scan over all the signed debit card applications. Also, she had us print 8 brand new cards and the 1 reprint. That cost her about $130 in fees because she demanded a new debit card. The best part is, my manager likely would have just waived the original $10 fee had she just been nice and asked. In a comment down below, OP added a few more things. It says, I feel like a few explanations are in order. 1. When I say numbers rubbed off, I mean a bit of the last two numbers being rubbed off. You can still tell what the numbers were, but it just didn't look like a card you get from every other bank. 2. The cards were not defective, they just weren't aesthetically pleasing enough for her liking. Each card was valid. 3. Yes, I did lead her to having new numbers, but that's because getting an entirely new card number requires your signature, while a simple reprint does not. She has been in the bank before complaining about the bank taking money out of her account for things she didn't sign off on, like overdraft fees and new debit card fees in the past. She even tried to get one of my other coworkers fired for something similar. So to avoid this, I got her signature on the card forms so she couldn't claim we did something she didn't authorize. It was to cover my butt. 4. Yes, she has been disclosed these fees multiple times, and upon signing 2 pages per printout, one is the signature request, one has the fees disclosed on it. She threw away the second paper despite my suggestion that she should read it. All fees are disclosed multiple times. So at the point where Karen said, give me the market manager's number this instant, so you're saying you actually don't know the market manager then? You just know their name, but you're not like a friend of theirs or anything because you don't have their number? You'd think somebody who's name dropping somebody would have a way to contact that person, right, Karen? On the other side of this one, this bank is producing bank cards that have numbers smudged off. That doesn't seem right to me, because if your printer isn't working properly and it can't produce a card without smearing the numbers, then you should probably stop using that machine. I also don't really think you can charge a customer for something that's coming out of your machine with an error on it. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think, comment down below.